I don't believe in accident. I believe in divine appointment. I was born into a devout Muslim home, and God had plans, wonderful plans. I've been there on the day I was going to kill myself. Jesus revealed himself to me, and he gave me a new life. And if you pray with me, and if you believe with me, God is going to give you a new life today. Jesus Christ is real. He changes lives, he changes destiny, and he changes nations. And those nations can change the world. We have a very special guest today, Baroness Carolyn Cox. She's a freedom fighter, British Parliament member. She works against sex slavery in the world and brings awareness about Islamization in the world, in the Western world as well. She has so many titles, but I just want to welcome her and thank you for being part of my show today.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a huge privilege and a great opportunity to share a little bit of the pain and the passion of being with brothers and sisters on front lines of faith and freedom around the world.
Yes, I truly, from the bottom of my heart, I appreciate your efforts. You're a true inspiration to many, many Christians and in the secular world for your efforts. Thank you so much.
I think the inspiration is really when I tell the stories and the reality of the people it's been our privilege to be with on those front lines of faith and freedom. They're the real heroes and heroines.
That's right.
And I think one of our main concerns at the moment is the horrendous persecution being carried out in the name of militant Islam or Islamism.
Yes.
Whenever one mentions this, one has to mention, of course, that the vast majority of the world's Muslims are a peaceful, often very hospitable people. Yes. But I'm deeply concerned about the growth of militant Islam or Islamism. It is ruthless and it is incredibly, formidably effective. There's been a lot in the news and on our television screens about the horrors being perpetrated by ISIS or Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, the brutal murder, torture, beheadings. That has been in the headlines, and I'm deeply concerned about that. We're also deeply concerned about the plight of those who've had to flee in order to survive. The Christians up in northern Iraq, around Erbil and so on. Very much on our agenda, very much on our concerns, and very much part of a humanitarian effort to try to get more effective shelter for them as winter kicks in, and winter out there is bitterly cold.
Yes.
But my main concern, perhaps in our conversation, is to talk about two parts of the world that have not hit the headlines so much, but where the suffering and the persecution are ferociously intense. My small NGO, or not-for-profit, charitable organisation, HART, Humanitarian Aid Relief Trust, works for.
And you are the founder and the president of it.
And the Chief Executive Officer, CEO of HART.
Yes.
And I set HART up to work for people suffering oppression and persecution, trapped behind closed borders or off the radar screen of major aid organisations. And that's briefly to put in that context my own personal biography for one moment. I always say about myself that I'm a nurse and a social scientist by intention. That's what I thought I was doing with my life. And I'm a baroness by astonishment. Now, you become a baroness in this old country of ours by being appointed to the House of Lords, which is the equivalent of the US Senate, or in any bicameral parliament, the Senate of a two-chamber parliament. And you know, I wasn't into politics. I don't much like politics, to be honest. And I was so much not into that world, I was actually the first baroness I'd ever met. Never met one before. And you wake up one morning and you find a baroness looking at yourself out of the bathroom mirror, and you say, well, thank you, God, that's quite a shock.
Yes.
And what a privilege. What a privilege to be able to speak in one of the houses of the British Parliament.
Absolutely, it gives you an open platform, right?
It's a huge privilege.
Yes.
But privilege brings responsibility.
That's right.
And I think I said to the good Lord, now how do I use this privilege? And I think the message came very clearly. To be able to speak in the British Parliament is a wonderful place to be a voice for the voiceless, to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. Yes. And so that's how I try to use the privilege of being in the British Parliament.
Wonderful.
And sometimes it's for people who don't have much of a voice in our own country, but increasingly in recent years being with our brothers and sisters suffering persecution who are off the radar screen. And one of the reasons why they're often off the radar screen is because the major aid organisations, the big names we all know like the UN, can only go places with the permission of a sovereign government. If a sovereign government is victimising minority in its own borders, doesn't give them permission to go, then they don't go. So the victims are left unreached, unhelped, unheard. So HART was set up to go where others don't go. And sometimes also the reason for aid organisations not going is for security.
Yes.
They're not allowed to go, it's too dangerous. Well, that's where HART goes. And to come back then to setting the scene, where we're currently deeply concerned and active, is one of the extensions of the kind of ISIS ideology.
Please tell us about it.
Well, northern Nigeria is horrendous. We were up in northern Nigeria a little way back, and the aid organisations are not there, and the media hasn't reported 1,000th of what's going on up there. We were there, say, this year. Hundreds and hundreds of people have been killed. The sort of equivalent of ISIS in northern Nigeria is Boko Haram. It is an Islamist ideology, and it has committed itself to driving all the Christians out of northern Nigeria. And so there are systematic attacks on churches, on Christian communities, and also many Muslims have been killed who will not adhere to Boko Haram's horrendous, brutal ideology.
Wow.
So some Muslims have also been killed by Boko Haram. But just to give a little idea of the scale, I don't know if you might remember the kidnapping of over 200 girls from a place called Chibok.
Yes.
Horrendous. And who knows where those girls are, probably sold into sexual slavery, some even being killed. Nobody knows. But that was horrendous. That hit the headlines. But when we were up in that part of northern Nigeria, we heard that this year, before those girls were kidnapped, over 1,800 others have been taken. We never heard of them. Hundreds since then. It's a reign of terror up there. Hundreds and hundreds of people have been killed this year already. So many martyrs already this year. And Boko Haram means also Western education is unacceptable. It is designed to eradicate Western education. And up in northern Nigeria, teachers have been slaughtered in schools. Haven't heard that. When we were there, we heard over 170 teachers have been killed, either in schools or at home. You're so terrified if you're a teacher up there, being identified. They won't even walk around with a pencil in case you're identified as being a teacher.
Wow, and this doesn't hit the media. We don't hear any of these things.
That's why I wanted to talk about it.
Wow.
I mean, because the Christian persecution is horrendous. We have partners up there in northern Nigeria. We have the Anglican Archbishop of the Diocese of Jos in Plateau State, the Bishop of Kano, which is a Sharia state, Bauchi, which is a Sharia state, and Boko Haram was born in Bauchi state in the north, and there's been so much killing and so much suffering, and it is a reign of terror, has not hit the headlines. We went to church with the Bishop of Kano, which is the capital city of a Sharia state, and when we went to church there, just a couple of weeks before we went there, 3 churches had been attacked by Boko Haram. They would go into the middle of church services, so drive a vehicle in and detonate it inside a church during a church service. So people who went to service in the morning to worship maybe never lived to the end of the service. And of course, for all those killed, the numbers injured are far greater. So 3 churches have been attacked just in the weeks before we were there in Kano. And we had a wonderful service with the bishop. One of the things that always humbles me is how the persecuted church worships with joy. Wow. You know, in that situation, they could be dead before the end of the service. When they worship with such joy. Real
even
joy.
In that persecution, even in that trial, and in the midst of that trial, they have joy in their worship. Isn't it amazing?
It is, and we find that wherever we go, the persecuted church worships with such joy. It's very humbling.
Wow. What do you do in those areas?
Well, we try to help with both aid and advocacy. HART was established to combine aid with practical help and advocacy, to be a voice, to speak for them. And so we do try and give some financial support, but we're tiny. I mean, I wish I was Bill Gates. I know what I would do with Bill Gates' money. You know, we would be able to do so much for people who have lost everything.
Yes.
And still worship with joy, but their needs are huge. For example, we have down in a village area, a rural community, in Kano State, which again is the Sharia state, the Christians suffer so much. There's discrimination there. So they can't get education. They're not, well, they could get healthcare, they have to pay for it, but they can't get jobs. So if your child is ill, going down with measles or malaria, maybe a father has to decide whether he'll sell his last pair of trousers or his last goat to get medical care for his children. But we have a wonderful brick building bishop who's down there, and since he was appointed a bishop in this diocese of Bari in Kano State, he's set up a brick building little enterprise in the middle. They built the school, they built the clinic.
Splendid.
And it's our privilege to pay the salaries for the school teachers. It's not very much per year, it's probably about $10,000 per year. But they now have a school right the way through all primary or junior level school and the first 3 years of high school, and really good education, and the clinic is the best in the area, so Muslims come to the clinic. So we can make a difference, but the needs are legion, and they do ask for our prayers. And sometimes people say, well, how can we help? Well, I always say, well, God has more ideas than I do.
Yes.
So we just remember that prayers without deeds is dead. Love without action is dead. So let's pray, but we also have to act, and act in practical terms. So that is my cri de coeur for the people of Nigeria. They are suffering horrendous persecution. I could show picture after picture after picture.
Yes.
But the other thing which is so humbling is our brothers and sisters out there, their churches are destroyed. They're back worshipping in the ruins within hours of the attack, but also they put out hands of friendship. And there are some very, very important attempts for interfaith initiatives, trying to reach out to the Muslim community, especially women to women. They've suffered so much. There's a very, very good program in Jos.
So needed.
So needed, whereby the wonderful Christian priest there, Christian pastor, Hassan John, he's got a wonderful program reaching out to the Muslim women, Christian women, Muslim women, healing the wounds, showing love in action, real love in action. He also has programs for boys and girls to meet and play together to heal the division between the communities. And that's enormously important, because those young people, if they're just left unemployed without education, they'll be vulnerable to radicalization. They'll be vulnerable to being recruited by Boko Haram and just paid a little bit of money to go and blow up a house or a church. So the interfaith relations, love in action, are really, really important, and we try to encourage those. So we try practical help, we try to support the healing, the love in action between the communities. And you must see, if you see the smiles of some of the Muslim women, they are so radiant to be affirmed, to be given some skill, so you have a little bit of economic self-empowerment. That's where the love has to be shown in the reality. But we also need to speak out and tell it how it is in terms of the suffering. And my little message about the persecuted church there but elsewhere, I've written a book, and see the cover of it, and it's about the persecuted church. And yes, churches are destroyed. It's called The Very Stones Cry Out. But the stones cry out with worship. So within hours, they're back worshipping. But also, churches are destroyed, but the church lives, the church grows, and the church loves. And that's the most humbling message from the persecuted church. Okay? Our buildings are destroyed, our people are killed, but we're still living. The church grows under persecution, and we always love.
That's wonderful.
And very briefly, I'd love also to talk about another place that's off the radar screen, which is the horrendous persecution, indeed, I think call it genocide, going on in Sudan.
Genocide, yes.
It really is. I mean, I was in Sudan many times during the previous war, when the president, al-Bashir, declared jihad, and he called it jihad, against all who opposed him. And that was a brutal, brutal war in which 2 million died, 4 million were displaced.
2 million died,
2 million died.
4 million misplaced.
Yes. And just living in destitution.
Yes.
And every month, the government in Khartoum will publish a list of airstrips that have opened to United Nations, Operation Lifeline Sudan, and all the big aid organizations, and the no-go areas. And I went 30 times to the forbidden areas, right away throughout the whole of South Sudan, east, west, and the Nuba Mountains in central Sudan, and also to the Beja people in the east, who are a Muslim, non-Arab people. And their suffering was horrendous. I would walk through killing fields again and again. Well, eventually a ceasefire was signed, and then there was a referendum for the South for independence, and I was there celebrating the independence of the birth of the world's newest nation.
Yes.
But then Khartoum now still is ruled by the same president, the Republic of Sudan, the Old North, and he has declared that he wants to turn his Republic of Sudan into a unified Arabic Islamic nation. So there you get a very similar ideology to ISIS or to Boko Haram, and indeed I think Sudan probably supports Boko Haram. And what is going on now is, I would say, genocide. There is constant aerial bombardment of the peoples who live in two of the southern states of the Republic of Sudan, the Nuba Mountains, or southern Kordofan, they call it, and Blue Nile.
Who is doing the bombing right
The government in Khartoum.
Government is killing their own people.
Yes. I mean, the constant air bombardment. I've been there. I've seen they're called Antonov planes, they use them as bombers, flying over and deliberately targeting schools, clinics, markets, people who are trying to harvest their crops. So in the Nuba Mountains, they're living in caves with deadly snakes. They never normally go in those caves. And you see the elderly ladies trying to plug every crack and crevice to stop the deadly snakes coming out. They say we're more afraid of the bombs than the snakes. In Blue Nile, they don't even have any mountains, so they hide in banks cut out of riverbeds, or they hide under trees. And of course that's terrible because you get wood splinters.
Yes.
They're some of the worst splinters. And there's constant aerial bombardment, and there are hundreds of thousands displaced and hiding and dying.
Does government take responsibility of doing that, and do they give any reason for doing this bombing?
Well, they say they want to turn the Republic of Sudan into a unified Arabic Islamic nation. So that it's ethnic cleansing of the Africans, and it's trying also to get rid of the Christians and the traditional believers.
Yes.
And many Muslims who don't support their ideology.
Yes.
And the women hiding in the caves, and also by the riverbanks.
But there are deadly poisonous snakes in those, so wherever they go there's a turmoil and death they are facing every day.
But so we'd never go in those
Yes.
caves, but we're terrified of the bombs.
Yes.
And one of the most heartbreaking things was when we were there, the bomb had been over, and we just asked some of the women if they would, and the children, if they'd just go and, as it were, pose for us in the caves, as they would be, and we knew they were, when the bombers come over, because we wanted to take a still photograph. It was heartbreaking, because as they went into the caves, some children playing about 100 feet down, playing just down about 100 feet, suddenly saw them going in the cave, and they thought that was a sign the bomber was coming, and the screams of terror as they clambered up the rocks to dive into those caves where the snakes are. I mean, that's Sudan today, and getting away with impunity. I mean, I asked a question in the House of Lords yesterday, highlighting the horrors of what is going on in Sudan with this constant air bombardment, the targeting of, say, schools, clinics, people harvesting their crops, and with impunity. Wow. And the reply very often is, well, we need to continue talking to Khartoum. And I say, well, Khartoum loves talking to you, and I think this would probably apply to the US administration too, to some extent.
Absolutely.
But of course they kill when they talk. And it is impunity. And they are carrying out this genocidal policy with impunity, and thousands, or tens of thousands, displaced, hiding in those terrible conditions. Some have had to flee to Ethiopia, some flee to South Sudan, already war-torn, and the others just hiding. And we were given money, I'm happy to say, by an organisation, 25,000 UK pounds sterling, for about $40,000, and our wonderful partners did actually get it through to the people in Blue Nile. And when we last visited, we visited a remote village. It was deserted because it had recently been bombed. We saw the fresh bomb craters. But there was a cross, a wooden cross lying on the ground, and our guide picked up this cross and brandished it. And he said, this is the cross with which they will have been worshipping God. And this was earlier this year at Christmas time. Now 450 of that village had already died of starvation. They're still worshipping God. Then we heard the sound of voices in the bush, and we followed them. We found the villagers just hiding with nothing in the bush. But they said, thank you so much. We got your food. And even if we die of bombs, we would rather die in our own land from bombs than have to flee into Ethiopia or South Sudan as refugees because we have no food. Thank you for the food.
Yes.
How important it is to be there. How important it is to tell their story, to have the evidence, but also to give a helping hand.
Yes.
But again, I wish I was Bill Gates, because we could do so much more. We are tiny. HART is a very small little organisation. We could do so much more. And our partner there, who must remain nameless for obvious reasons, but in his report to us, he said HART is the only organisation providing any help in the whole of Blue Nile State.
Wow.
So
amazing.
Please, our brothers and sisters out there on that front line of persecution really need prayers.
Absolutely.
And we need to remember prayers without deeds are dead.
Yes.
They need practical action, however God shows that to be for each particular person who does pray, who does care, and who wants to do something.
Absolutely, and I want to encourage people, because when we think about multitudes of people that we need to help, sometimes people give up saying, I cannot change the situation, but we can take care of one person at a time with whatever we can give, whatever we can contribute to the cause. And if everybody, all Christians can come together, put their efforts, put their monies together, they can make a huge difference through your organization.
Absolutely. I mean, our little organisation, there's only 5.5 of us in HART UK, but it doesn't matter. We work through local partners. They're the heroes and heroines, and money goes directly to them. It goes through no middle person, through no government, directly to them, and they are wonderful. We say mustard seed people, the multiplier effect, the little we give them, is multiplied enormously by their resourcefulness and their generosity and their efficiency and reliability.
That's wonderful. I want to focus on a little bit more ISIS before I go to the next subject. You know, on the media we see how Western world is reacting to ISIS. Is this a terrorist organization? Is it not? We couldn't even pass that stage. But meantime, ISIS and its propaganda and its hurt damage is growing. And what do you think that needs to be done at this point with ISIS?
Well, I think first of all we have to have a very realistic assessment of exactly what its agenda is, what its capabilities are, and also realise that it's not only in Syria and Iraq. It is critical there, it's crucial there, and obviously it's one of the main front lines, but it is part of a bigger picture. It goes round in a kind of crescent. Al-Shabaab is again part of the same ideology, and then Boko Haram is, and indeed I think Boko Haram is supported by Al-Shabaab, and I'm sure they all come with the same ideology, and we have to be really realistic. And one of the things that worried me earlier on is when I think the United States and certainly the British government were thinking of giving military intervention. This is before the present situation of ISIS, but in the earlier days when President Assad was very much in the news, by no means an angel, I would say. There's a lot he's responsible for. But the opposition, the Islamic and Islamist opposition, well, we're seeing how that's developed. And there was a time earlier on when President Obama and David Cameron wanted to support the Islamic opposition. And at that time, it was not, we believe, the right thing to do. There was a debate in the House of Lords, and virtually everyone spoke against that. Our chiefs of defence staff, people who really know what they're talking about. I spoke against it because we had desperate messages from the church leaders in Syria at that time saying, look, Syria is the only country in the Middle East, apart from Israel, with genuine freedom of religion. You can all worship freely in Syria, and for women. Women had much more freedom there than anywhere else in the Middle East. Now, at that time, I think the military intervention would have made things much worse. It could well have gone into the hands of the Islamists anyway. Now it's a different scenario, and I think ISIS does need to be stopped, and I'm no pacifist. I believe that there is such a thing as a just war, and I think we do need to be absolutely realistic that ISIS is extremely well resourced, very well funded, very, very committed, and fanatically committed to its ideology, and it does need to be taken seriously, and whatever it takes to stop the carnage, stop the slaughter, and one hopes, difficult, but to bring back some degree of security and some degree of safety. And one of the, of course, tragic things about the whole ISIS escalation has been the hemorrhage of Christians from the original Bible lands. I mean, they've had to flee. I mean, many, as we know, who haven't fled have been killed or abducted into forced slavery. Who knows what's happened to many of them. I mean, horrors untold and probably unimaginable. People are suffering that now while we're talking here. There does need to be, as I say, a totally realistic assessment. Very difficult for the people who live there to know whether it's right to flee into safety, into other countries, if other countries will receive them, or whether somehow to hang in there so that they're not leaving completely the lands where Christianity was born. At the moment they are suffering enormously. They need humanitarian help.
Yes.
And I think it needs a very realistic political and whatever it takes to take ISIS as seriously as needs to be taken.
Absolutely, because my concern is Western world is seeing everything is done far away from them and feeling or thinking that naively they are immune from any attacks of the ISIS. But current situation is showing that ISIS is integrating into the Western world right now. And anytime something could happen in the Western world, and I just want the awareness of the governments to wake up. I want to tell them, wake up, because this situation is not in the Middle East anymore. They are in Europe, they are in America, they are in Canada, and we are going to pay a big price, I am afraid, if we don't open our eyes and start doing something about it.
Absolutely. And of course, many of the young jihadists have gone out from Britain, from United States, other countries, and they're fighting out there now. But of course, in the first place, they've got that ideology before they went. How did they get it? How did they become engaged with ISIS in the first place? And so ideologically committed, they wanted to go and fight. But secondly, those who survive are going to come back. And they're going to come back with a lot of know-how in terms of terrorism and in terms of conflict techniques, and presumably many of them with still the same ideology. So yes, it is not a far-off phenomenon. I mean, I believe it's far off. My heart stands for being with people on those front lines, so we feel we should be there anyway. But even if people just feel it's so far away and it's not our business and it's not going to affect us, that is a dangerous misperception.